What you'll read in textbooks is not the whole story. In fact, it's not even the most interesting part of the story, which is perhaps why they're textbooks and not novels or best-selling nonfiction. It's not that they're wrong, it's just that what you really need to know about research is often not found in written form. Janet Bavelis of the University of Victoria says it this way. She says, the best known part of scientific research, the published report, is the visible fruition of a much longer process, the beginnings of which are different from its final form. What the reader of the academic article doesn't see are the meetings over coffee, the shaping and reshaping of central driving questions, the frustrations when something does not go just right, and the exhilaration when a new discovery is born, not to mention the writing and rewriting of a single sentence until calluses form. As an undergraduate, I was intrigued by how knowledge was created, so I went to graduate school to figure this out. Much to my surprise, I found out that knowledge creation is often clumsy and chaotic. In the process of discovery, researchers choose problems that are personally, politically, or otherwise important. They design surveys and experiments using a range of informal and formal procedures, and they collect, analyze, and interpret data outside of a vacuum. Likewise, scientific theories are often initiated through creative moments or intuitive hunches. To suggest that researchers are merely rigorous, blindly following specific procedures is to turn them into machines. Though I believe that all good research is systematic in some ways, so too is good research imaginative work. An example of what you might find in a textbook is something like this, that the researcher starts with a purpose, investigates the literature, situates the phenomenon in a theory, deduces hypotheses, develops procedures, collects and analyzes data, and then discusses those data as they do or do not support the theory. And that's certainly how a research article is written. But suggesting that the creative activity of doing research is always this nice and neat is a misrepresentation of colossal proportions. And that's the important distinction between what you might read in a textbook and what I hope to accomplish in this and a following talk. The distinction between doing research and reading about doing research, between being in the throes of it all and being an observer or an interested consumer. The fact is, doing research is messy. Good research is generative, not bound to strict rules, and able to change the way we think about our lives and those around us. As researchers, we have guidelines for sure, but all guidelines have exceptions, and we make those exceptions, and we have pretty distinct reasons and valid reasons for breaking norm. My goal today is to talk about how to think like a researcher, someone who's passionate about ideas, and even more so about watching other people succeed in generating new and exciting ways of knowing about listening and human behavior. And so I'm going to talk today, first of all, by exploring 4 attitudes that I think are necessary for conducting good research. And then I'm going to turn my attention to what I view as a necessary component of quality scholarship, which is good theory. And then I'll end by suggesting some resources and additional readings. All right, so first things first, what are those attitudes of a good researcher? I think first and foremost that what you need is to be passionate about what you study. Now, in my 10-plus years in the ILA, I can say that I've met very few people who aren't passionate, so I'm probably preaching to the choir on this point. Like your intimate relationships, if your research lacks passion, you lose interest. Your eyes wander, and soon you have a mistress who you ultimately start a new life with before you know what hit you. If you're an academic, this mistress is often service. It's much, much easier to go to meetings and sit on committees. The payoffs are immediate, and you're often thanked for your time and effort. Service is seductive, and though it is important, it can take away from contributing to our store of knowledge. If you own your own business or you do consulting, your mistress is the client. Picking up an extra client certainly means putting bread on the table, but how do you know if your most recent program is effective? How can you tell whether you should do a half-day presentation or try to establish a longer-term relationship with a client? It's research that paves the way. Without research, you won't have anything to train in the first place. So passion for research will provide you that important motivation to say no to things that can take you away from the excitement of discovery. Second attitude that I believe is important for doing good research is curiosity. Simply being curious about your surroundings helps you, particularly if you're a social scientist, and most of us who study human behavior were people watchers at an early age. Stories abound about the physicist who used to sit on her front lawn, looking up into the night sky, wondering if there exists life outside Earth, or of the anthropologist who turned every childhood game into a search for bones. Personally, when I was in high school, I worked pumping gasoline and changing oil for a man named Len Dawson. He was a linguist. Of course, he wasn't formally trained as a linguist, but he certainly did have a knack for correcting my and everyone else's language choices. Suppose, for example, a driver entered the store asking, which way to I-65? I might give directions like, well, you go up here, you take a right at the red light, and you continue until you see the Episcopal School. About 2 miles later, you'll see the interstate above you. Hang an immediate left, and you're on the service road. So the person leaves, and Len turns to me and says, what if the light is green? I learned to be careful in how I used language, but even more careful in how I attended to other people. There's a mysterious power in language, and even more power in being a good listener. So when I finally declared communication as my undergraduate major, I remembered Len's influence. Partly because of the interaction with him and his way of listening, I am intimately curious about how it is that we come to understand people with whom we interact. This curiosity peaked in the context of supportive communication after conversations with Brant Burleson and when I decided to go study with him at Purdue. You know, at times when it's so desperately needed, why don't we listen? And really, more importantly and fundamentally than that, what does that even mean? What does it mean to be a good listener? I stress to my students all the time that, you know, you go to the grocery store and you're in line and you see the magazines, those popular press books, those magazine articles, and they seem to have an easy answer to many of those questions that we struggle with for decades as communication scholars. That inherent curiosity that sparked me as a 15-year-old garage technician, I think abounds in our social world. I think what we do as researchers matters, and I hope personally that my research can begin to answer some of the important questions that are so often asked, but answered in very vague and often nebulous ways with popular press books and magazines. Answering important questions about human communication is made easier and exorbitantly more enjoyable in a team environment, and so my third attitude of a good researcher is humility. Good colleagues and good students are invaluable, and those who can question fundamental assumptions and otherwise cause me to rethink how to answer a particular question are the best. I believe that my research is made stronger by reading widely and by surrounding myself with intelligent people who can assist in my interpretation of how human communication seems to work. Most of those people are much brighter than I am, much better at research than I might ever be. I have something to learn every day, something that can make me a better student of human communication. The important thing is to learn about listening, not to be right or not to put plaques on my shelf. Even that editorial board member who called my research worthless and made me pull my hair out at 2 a.m. when I couldn't sleep has something valuable to say. It's going to take me a few days to find that out and realize what it is, of course, but everyone with a critique has at least something valuable to say. The last attitude that I believe is important for conducting good research is persistence. When I was in college, I was fortunate enough to get a job selling advertising space for a telephone directory that was targeted to fraternities and sororities. And we would go to Chicago and LA for sales training, during which the motto was persistence pays profits. Now, I don't think that the sales context is completely isomorphic with the academic context, but I think it is safe to say that as a researcher, I have to remember this same motto. Persistence means staying with a question even though the answer seems impossible to come by. It means staying with a project even when there are very few other people outside of my own research team who think that what we're doing has any sort of news value. Persistence means putting yourself out there, taking risks, ultimately staying the course. Good research can cause others to fundamentally question what they believe about human behavior, and that's not a comfortable thing for most of us to do. We often stick tenaciously to our own beliefs, and change really is hard. Persistence means striving for accuracy even in the face of unbelief. So in general, to think like a researcher is to first take on the attitude of a researcher, to be passionate, curious, humble, and persistent. I mean, lots of passionate, curious, humble, and persistent people are not good researchers. So while necessary, these are not sufficient conditions for good research. It's my belief that good research also necessitates a focus on theory. And that's what we'll turn to now, the importance of theory. In my opinion, theory is simply an answer to the question why. The terms theory and model are often used synonymously, interchangeably, but I don't think that they're the same thing, and there's some evidence for that as well. Models are useful, and they're often graphical representations of a concept like listening, but they don't explain why things are related. In a chapter hidden in the back of Roberts and Watson's Intrapersonal Communication Processes text, Andrew Wolven suggests the following. Models of the listening process can assist listening scholars, students, and educators alike in coming to terms with the complexities of this communication behavior. A general model of the listening process can be a valuable starting point for understanding the intricacies of the process, how the elements of listening fit together. So Wolven presents several models, including one of the earliest developed by Sarah Lundstein, and one of the most popular that's presented by Manny Stile, Larry Barker, and Kitty Watson. Now, I don't want you to focus on the specifics of those models, and so regardless of the specifics, models of listening do nothing more than define the term. They set the boundary conditions for what can be studied as listening, what counts as study of listening. So necessarily, all models are not only incomplete, but they're not right or wrong. They're simply more or less useful for a particular purpose. Don't be fooled into thinking that you have to take someone else's definition or someone else's model as your own. If that model doesn't work for you, create another one or adapt it for your particular purposes. Even when you have a model, though, whether you take it from somebody else or you create your own, you're still left questioning why. So I want you to take a moment and read the following conversation between two sisters, Brooks and Lawrence, to help illustrate the difference between models and theories. So what do you think happened when Brooks and Lawrence hung up their phones? If it were me, after I got frustrated and perhaps yelled a little bit that my sibling wasn't meeting me for lunch, I would then ask, why did this happen? Why did we have this misunderstanding? And perhaps if you're Brooks, you might think, well, the reason Lawrence misunderstood me is that she just didn't listen, which is a popular thing to say when there's a misunderstanding, to blame the other person for not listening. And if you invoke that reason, that Lawrence didn't pay attention, which led to a misunderstanding, which led to her not showing up for lunch, then you're engaging in informal theory making. You're providing a simple explanation, answering that question, why did this happen? And really, anytime you ask questions that seek a more abstract or general answer to a particular circumstance, you're constructing a theory. A theory is basically a careful, systematic, and self-conscious discussion and analysis of some aspect of human interactive life. As scholars, we attempt to answer questions like, how does communication work, and why do misunderstandings happen? When scholars ask questions like these, we attempt to momentarily abstract some specific or common experience and to look at that experience in a more general way. Researchers primarily give meaning to the actions, objects, and events of our common experience through their placement within a theory. And concepts like listening take on various meanings as they are studied through various theoretical perspectives. And so theories help give structure to otherwise structureless concepts. They guide practice in complex situations. And I believe that that's the primary strength of theory-driven research, or research which primarily attempts to understand and explain some practical problem in a general and abstract way. Theory attempts to momentarily abstract some specific or common experience to take a look at that experience from afar. As John Dewey says, abstraction is the heart of thought. There's no way other than accident to control and enrich concrete experience except through an intermediate flight of thought with conceptions, relations, abstracta. And so not wholly unlike your speculations after a confusing conversation, scholars attempt to abstract from particular instances a more general understanding of human communicative life. But unlike informal theories, formal theories are based on more in-depth and systematic exploration of human interaction. You can go about proposing and acting on any number of informal theories without ever formally submitting them to any strict test, whereas scholars eventually must either test their theories with some form of data, whether those data be survey, performances, case studies, texts, or examples, or they're going to have to apply their theories to solve some practical issue. And whereas your own personal theory is typically only subject to criticism from yourself, scholars must face the academic judge and jury if their theory is to be accepted and valid. Suppose, for instance, you're interested in the nature of supportive communication, and that is defined here for you. Those specific things that we do when we're trying to help somebody out in a stressful circumstance. In your daily life, you certainly have observed the fact that there are many ways in which a helper can provide assistance. Some of your friends and family are highly supportive. They're very helpful when you're stressed. Of course, there are others that you avoid like the plague because they make you feel worse about yourself. But while your own experience is interesting to you, much more helpful and practical would be a theoretical classification of message types into those that are more generally helpful and those that are more generally harmful. Even more helpful would be the theoretical specification of when messages have their effects on particular people and particular circumstances and why this is the case. Scholars have proposed several typologies of supportive behavior, ranging from very general typologies that classify support as emotional, informational, and tangible assistance, to more specific typologies like the one described by Burleson and his colleagues. His typology of comforting messages orders the phenomenon of emotional support, or messages that attempt to help people dealing with an upsetting event. He classifies emotional support by looking at ways in which it can be done. In particular, emotional support is classified in terms of 9 hierarchically ordered message types, arranged from the most to the least sensitive. Then the typology explains why some messages are likely to be perceived as more sensitive than others. In particular, the theory proposes that messages are more sensitive because they're more person-centered. Person-centeredness in the context of support is the extent to which messages explicitly acknowledge, elaborate, legitimize, and contextualize the feelings and the perspective of a distressed other person. In other words, person-centeredness is a theoretical explanation for why some messages work better than others. They work because they take into account and adapt to the subjective, emotional, and relational aspects of communicative contexts. So you've got messages that are ordered in the lower third of this hierarchy called low person-centered messages. These are those messages that explicitly deny or criticize emotions. They tell people how they should act or should feel. Messages that are in the middle of the hierarchy are called moderately person-centered messages. These messages implicitly acknowledge or recognize emotions, or they help to distract people from the distressing event, try to get their mind off it some way by focusing on something else. They offer basically non-feeling-centered explanations for the stressful experience. And finally, highly person-centered messages are those that afford explicit recognition of emotions, and they help people to explore how the feelings that they're feeling about this particular circumstance fit within a broader context. So to study this, we have typically studied it on college students, but this applies to a range of stressors, and it has been replicated from individuals from a very young age to individuals, to elderly individuals as well. And so what I'm going to play you are two messages, a low person-centered message, one that challenges the legitimacy of another person's feelings. I'm going to play that second because I want to contrast that with a highly person-centered message, one that acknowledges, elaborates, and legitimizes emotions. And what I'm going to play you are messages in the context of students were asked to imagine that they were enrolled in a class that's required to enter their academic major, and they need to B in order to get in their major in this particular class, but in fact they make a D, which causes them, of course, to have to retake the class, and they can't get in their major, and all of the other things that follow from doing something like that. So basically this is a relatively serious stressor, and one that's very common among the individuals that we studied in this particular experiment. So I want to play the highly person-centered message first.
Yeah, I understand. You must feel really bummed out. I mean, when you study and go to class and, you know, well, all that hard work and getting a bad grade, it's really frustrating. The same thing happened to me earlier this year. I really had enough of it. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that can make you feel crazy. It's probably hard to look at it this way and all, but maybe you've learned something from this that will help you to do better when you retake the class.
And so contrast that with the low person-centered message.
Indeed. Maybe you're just not trying hard enough. I mean, did you study? You know, if not, you shouldn't be so upset. I'm sure that you'll get a B if you study harder. It might help if you just, like, try to forget about the class. Remember that there are more important things in the world than getting into a major and, you know. Anyway, it's a pretty dumb class. It's really not worth worrying about. So just try to forget about it. Just think about something else. Yeah.
And so what you see with these messages is a clear distinction between the explicit denial and criticism of emotions and the explicit acknowledgement and recognition of those emotions and trying to fit those feelings into a broader context. Clearly, when we seek support from other people, that support is couched within the context of conversations. And really the point of a theory of supportive messages like this is to try to figure out what are those characteristics of helpful conversations and helpful relationships. And so the larger point is that we're typically going to feel much better, and we're going to be much better able to cope when we are around people who allow us to explore why we're feeling certain ways and to explore you know, how those emotions that we're feeling at that particular moment fit within the larger context of how we ought to be acting given the relative stressors in our lives and the other elements of our stressful situation. And so clearly people who, when you go to them for support, who shoot you down initially, who basically delegitimize what you're feeling, those are the people that put you down. Those are the people that make you question you know, whether what you're feeling is legitimate, and therefore whether you should be you know, be worried about the stressor, which clearly is not going to help you to rethink things. And so there's 30 years of scholarship that finds that messages within the highly person-centered type are better. They help us feel better, and they help us cope more successfully with later stressors than do messages of the low person-centered type. And so based on cumulative research, our theory of supportive communication can predict how people are likely to react when confronted with messages that contain a certain level of person-centeredness, and we can potentially control the outcomes of support by instituting training programs that attempt to educate people about how to craft highly person-centered messages. However, over this 30 years of research, what you'll find is that sometimes the outcomes of comforting messages vary, at least somewhat, as a function of the person giving the message, the person receiving the message, and the situation, particularly the stressfulness of the situation. And so sometimes highly person-centered messages make us feel a lot better, and other times they don't make us feel that much better. And sometimes low person-centered messages exacerbate stress. Other times, low person-centered messages don't have as large of an impact on outcomes. An important question is why? What is it about the source, the recipient, the situation, and so forth that might help us to better predict the utility of not only verbal person-centered messages, but clearly a range of characteristics of messages that have been found to impact outcomes. My colleagues and I have been working on this for several years, and we basically propose a motto that reads, to understand how comforting messages work, we must first understand how these messages are worked on or processed by their recipients. So we believe that the impact of supportive behaviors on outcomes is both a function of the content of those behaviors and how those behaviors are processed by recipients. One of the primary contributions of what we call the dual process theory of supportive message outcomes is to suggest a reason why messages often have variable impacts on people's coping. Specifically, the theory predicts that when individuals' motivation and ability to process are high, messages and other behaviors that require extensive thinking will have a greater impact than when people are not motivated or unable to process those elements of support. The going theory of how highly person-centered messages work is through what Burleson and Goldsmith in '98 called the conversationally induced reappraisals. In other words, supportive conversations, particularly those that contain highly person-centered support, help us to reappraise our problematic event. Of course, messages aren't magic bullets. They're not infused into hypodermic needles. I can't stick you in the leg and make you feel better by my message. And so the idea here is that over time in a conversation, we begin to think about our situation differently because of the way in which other people help us to do that. This is a highly cognitively taxing process to go through. In order to reappraise or rethink, in order to reframe our situation in different terms, takes a lot of cognitive energy. And so if we don't have that cognitive energy, in particular when a stress is very, very, very high, we don't have the cognitive energy to do that. There's no amount of talking to somebody else that's going to change our thinking. Very similarly, when we're stressed about something quite minor, it really just takes time. That because the stress is very minor, because it doesn't really impact us a great deal, that stressor is going to dissipate over time anyway. And so the thinking is that both at very low levels of stress and very high levels of stress, what people say doesn't matter as much as what they say in situations where there is sort of an ideal amount of stress. And of course, I don't mean that in terms of like you should have this level of stress in your life. It's ideal for you to work. But in terms of the theory that we're talking about, there's an ideal level of stress that if you have that, conversations and other sorts of forms of messages will impact you more so than other elements of the supportive environment. So when I'm motivated to process elements in my environment, and when I'm able to do that, when there's a sufficient level of stress but it's not too high that I'm not able to process things, that's when messages have their greatest outcome, and other elements of the supportive environment have less of an outcome. And so we believe that this theory puts a little bit of a nuanced spin on the impact of supportive messages, taking it into a larger contextual milieu of the things that are going on as we are dealing with stress and dealing with people who are trying to make us feel better about that stress. All right, so before I close, I think it's important to go back and highlight some distinctions, or at least one primary distinction, about how I view theory and how others might sort of view me as viewing theory. I want to be clear, although theory is a necessary part of all good research, I'm not suggesting that all research is designed to test theory. In fact, the dual process theory of supportive communication outcomes that I just briefly summarized was born out of us looking at the literature and going, why is it that sometimes messages have these rather large effects and other times they have rather minimal effects? We saw a phenomenon. We saw a pattern of behavior that didn't have an explanation. And so the initial theoretical legwork was to sort of summarize and explain those data rather than to test anything formally. Now we're in the stage where we're actually testing some of these ideas. And the next time that we talk, the next time that I talk about research, which will be sometime in December, we'll go over, we'll use some of the research that we've been using in order to illustrate some ideas that I have about how to act like a researcher. And so the larger point for today is that, theory of the descriptive type, theory that describes what's going on, that sort of gives a geography of, in our case, of supportive talk or supportive communication, or how those messages are processed. That sort of descriptive theory is just as valuable as theory of the prescriptive type, as the theory that deduces hypotheses and sort of is the stereotypical social scientific approach to research. I mean, fields like biology and physics have survived for centuries by first attempting to understand nature and not by first imposing some theoretical structure on nature. As Harry Reese and Shelley Gable put it, to carve nature at its joints, one must first locate those joints. And that quote certainly brings us full circle to the attitudes that I laid out at the beginning, that good researchers are primarily a curious bunch, that we notice things around us and we gradually formalize our observations over time. Hunches and intuition along with imagination turn eventually into a curiosity of why there exist these patterns of human behavior. If we aren't seduced by service or other sort of mistresses, we start to investigate those questions more systematically, all the while with an eye toward theory building. Good research tests theory, but it also often ignores it. And sometimes the best discoveries are those that happen outside of conventional thinking. It's hard to think outside the box if the box is on your head, clouding your vision. So as I promised, I've got a slide here of additional resources, and I'll certainly provide PDF copies of these articles to those who have trouble locating them. And these are basically the foundation of where I'm getting my information, and particularly for this talk that I shared with you today. So for next time, we're going to discuss acting like a researcher. It's more nuts and bolts, and it's focused on defining useful vocabulary that researchers use in their published reports. We'll extend the example of supportive communication to show how we've gone about testing our theoretical ideas of when and why messages have their effects on outcomes in order to illustrate some of those vocabulary and how you might be able to discern sort of what a scholar is talking about when they're presenting things in very jargony ways. So thank you for your time.